Welcome to Wrestling and Everything, Coast to Coast, with your host, Buddy Sotello, Esquire. And this time we are now actually more wrestling coast to inland, because we're dealing with Ryan Boman here in Illinois. So welcome. And Ryan is a very accomplished writer and contributor to a number of different sites and podcasts, both about sports and about wrestling. So it's great to have you here. You've been a former guest on the show, and welcome to Wrestling and Everything.
Thanks a lot, man. You know, it seems like it's been a while since we get to do this, so this ought to be a lot of fun tonight.
Yes, absolutely. So first, tell a little bit, for those who who don't remember you, or maybe this is their first time seeing you, give us a little bit of your background in professional wrestling and in sports.
Well, actually, I started as a sports writer when I was a teenager. I was, I guess, 14, and with my local newspapers, and then I've written for a number of publications over the years, and then obviously with technology, I've moved on to writing for websites now, and just about 4.5 years ago, I started a website called thegorillaposition.com, ran it up till last year, and then sold it and went to freelancing. So I'm writing whole websites right now, including sportskeeda.com and Last Word on Pro Wrestling. So, you know, it's been kind of, as much as I miss the old place, it's also sort of a relief to not have to be the boss anymore. So it's been kind of fun to get out and do some different things and not really have the chains or the responsibilities of being an administrator somewhere, just being able to do my own thing every day.
Great. So tell fans a little bit about Sportskeeda and what it's all about, and what kind of articles you write for Sportskeeda.
Mostly now we have a variety of different types of stories, but I kind of find mine to be a little bit unique. One of my editors even said that I'm more of a feature writer, kind of. I always loved the mentor Bill Apter gave me. You know, when I got into writing about wrestling, Bill was the first person to take me under his wing. You know, and then we became, you know, great friends. But he always says, "Time, you know, I'm not a reporter. I'm a storyteller." And that's kind of, I've taken that and kind of ran with it as far as the way I look at things. I want to tell this, I want it to be kind of a symphony from the beginning to the end that makes people think, instead of just, this guy beat that guy. You know, I kind of want to, I always like to put a little angle and a little symbolism into everything.
I definitely noticed that from reading your articles. You have a lot of insight. You give a lot of insight to when you write. Can you tell me about your first involvement in pro wrestling and what made you a fan of professional wrestling?
Well, what made me a fan was when I was very, very, very small. One of the first TV shows I ever remember watching was Wrestling at the Chase in St. Louis. And I'm probably 5 at the time. And, my brothers had it on the weekends, and I became enamored with it. And then when I could drive, I started going to small shows, just local shows, and got to know wrestlers and started hanging out with the guys, and did some ring announcing for a couple companies, did a little bit of refereeing, I think only a couple times, but, you know, more or less a chance to get a taste of that culture.
Did you work with any big names while you were in the Indies?
I mean, a lot of former ECW guys like Axel Rotten, Balls Mahoney, people like that. Oh my gosh. I mean, I probably worked, obviously being a writer now, I've worked more with, bigger than back then. A lot of the indie shows, you know, it's hard to remember because a lot of the indie shows back then were just, it was a lot of the indie guys and one name from a former company. You know, One Man Gang, I think I worked a show with him. You know, some of the guys that were veterans that were kind of out of the big promotions and just kind of making the loop, making shots on the road.
Any of the younger indie guys go on to do anything big? Did you see any guys while they were, just starting out and then they became bigger stars?
You know, there was a lot of guys in the Midwest. I mean, I saw, like Matt Sydal. I was there for his first match. That was early 2000s. But, before that, I got to see when CM Punk wrestled in IWA Mid-South. I wasn't working that show, but I was there. and to see what he went on to do. And I believe, I believe he wrestled Eddie Guerrero on that card, because Eddie was kind of away from, that was during a sabbatical he had from WWE for some things that went on. And, I again, it's kind of hard to put it together because there were so many names and faces back then that just, it's more to me. I think I always try to remember the more obscure guys that I can see their face or I can remember their gimmick, but I can't think of their names. It's more of it's weird that I always wonder about.
Yeah. Well, it's you never know. It's these guys could actually. I guess now the guys from the early 2000s, they haven't made it now. They probably aren't going to make it. But
Exactly.
But I always tell people that's a good reason to go to an indie fed show, is that you never know when you're going to see a future star. Or, I mean, I got to see a guy named the Prototype, wrestle quite a bit, and he turns into John Cena. So it's nice to say, you've seen people, and this guy Samoa Joe that no one had ever heard of.
Yeah.
Took a dive out.
I can remember getting the tapes from out there in like the late 90s, early 2000s when those guys, I think there was a series of tapes that came out, working session tapes or something like that.
Yeah, that was back then. I mean, before the internet was really huge and everyone put their stuff on YouTube. If you didn't trade tapes with people, you wouldn't get a chance to see any indie stuff. And, it was so hard to copy videotapes back then. Most people didn't do it. So, that's why a lot of those early matches are either lost because just nobody ever recorded any of them, or they're on VCR and nobody has VCRs anymore, and nobody can watch it unless it gets converted over to YouTube. So, that who knows when all that stuff is going to get converted. I even have a fair amount of a few APW tapes that I still need to just sit down and do the time. The problem with videotapes is that if you have 8 hours worth of video, it takes at least 8 hours to transcribe it all to your computer, because you can't run the videotape any faster than it takes to play it. So that's one of the reasons.
The computer can go fast, but it can't.
Right. The videotape can only go a certain speed and still be legible. So all my priceless global footage from Global Wrestling is all on tape and is staying there, I think, for all eternity, until either I dump all that stuff, pay to get it converted, or we have a fire and that's the end of that.
And it's all gone. Yeah.
So, and you're wearing your AEW t-shirt, obviously, and that's your main beat right now, isn't it?
Pretty much most of it. What I do is AEW.
So what are your thoughts about AEW currently? And you were talking about seeing CM Punk earlier, live. What are your thoughts about AEW right now?
I can't believe anybody wouldn't be excited about doing. I mean, I know there's a lot of diehard WWE fans that don't want to hear that, but they are on the rise. They're doing a lot of really great things. They have the biggest buzz right now in wrestling, and that's where it starts. I mean, do I think they're going to ever overtake WWE? Probably not, but they can at least grow to the point. I mean, they're not going to ever probably reach the levels that gets as far as viewerships because of the cable versus terrestrial TV difference. But if they could match Raw's numbers and be right there in that same category in just that's amazing. And anybody that's a real wrestling fan should be rooting for just because I'm wearing a shirt doesn't mean I'm rooting against WWE. And just like vice versa, I would say don't root against AEW, root for both of them, because you don't want one to go away or the other to go away, because that just makes wrestling in general weaker. We need more competition out there. We need more, whether you like WWE or you hate it, or you like AEW or you hate it, the idea that you just have this again is exciting. And as a fan, you should appreciate that and not, make snide comments about either company. You can, again, say, hey, I don't like this one, I'm going to watch this one, but don't root for one to die, because that's just bad for the business in general.
Yeah, obviously, when there was only one Fed and the WWE ruled the roost, and they bought out ECW and they bought out WCW, and they even had all the AWA old footage. You know, they owned all the quality of wrestling was probably at its lowest. You know,
Yeah.
but you can't put a jar on wrestling, can you? It's just not something that anyone can just own, like the way the NFL owns football.
Right.
Because I think in a couple of ways. One is because there's always more wrestlers than there are matches for them. You know, there's always a surplus of talented guys and gals that could get in the ring and wrestle than you have match spots available for them.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing about that is you can go so far as saying I would love to see another third major company pop up. Like, I know there's Ring of Honor and there's Impact, but I'm talking about on that national cable stage as well. And we just have an all-out.
NXT was kind of doing it, but I think Vince McMahon got upset with NXT upping it in the ratings and being, you know, the favored child of the two. And the recent moves by Vince, I think, has really been to cripple and to denigrate the NXT product and to sort of say, look, if I can't make the WWE better, at least I can make next worse so that WWE is better.
I mean, there's a lot of people that have that theory. I think, I don't know, sometimes I think it's just he feels like he has to have his hand in everything. And when the ratings they didn't get the ratings, that when they didn't beat AEW on Wednesday nights and it moved to Tuesdays, I think after watching how Vince is he hates to lose anything. I think it just ate at him long enough that he said, okay, I'm stepping in, I'm changing everything. I really do believe based on everything I've ever seen or heard about Vince, that would not shock me. That it was just one of the, you guys lost. You obviously don't know what you're doing. I need to come in and fix things.
But I don't think he's fixing anything, you know, as far as, you know, what the general critical consensus is. You know, he's not fixing very much, and a lot of the talent is leaving because they're so disillusioned with how they're being treated. And Vince himself, I think, has gone into the kind of this Howard Hughes mode where he's so paranoid of anyone that could challenge his power structure that he is getting rid of them, firing them, or denigrating them to the point where they want to get up and leave.
I will say this, though, and NXT, I don't know who most of the people are now. They brought in almost a whole fresh new crew. But I will say SmackDown and Raw, these past two episodes, I thought were really good. And I actually told them about how, you know, hey, are they actually going to do this? Are they going to turn the corner? Or is this where they come to the cross and they make the right turn? You know, if they could continue to do what they do week in and week out, what they've done over the last, you know, the Madison Square Garden show, Fridays, and last night's episode of Raw, I'm sorry. You know, if they can do that week in and week out, the product is going to improve exponentially. That's always been the issue, is that they get something started and then it's a start-stop type of system for some reason. And that's why it seems like, I think they've done that so many times, the fan base is just, that's why people have stopped watching, you know, because as soon as they get into something, Bray Wyatt is a great example. Twice the fans got behind him, and both times they pulled the rug from underneath it for whatever reason.
And you know? Yeah, and I don't get the impression that Big E is a really popular champion with a lot of people. At least, you know,
I think internet people, but I you know, fans react to him, so that's all. I mean, if you hear making noise in the arena, you know, popping for him, that's all I ever go by. I know there's a lot of people on the internet that are taking shots at that move to put the belt on him, but so he looked good in the match with Roman Reigns and Bobby Lashley last night, and you know, just I don't know. I mean, we'll see what happens. It's just, you know, we're barely into it right now, so you know, it may be one of those things that he's getting a lot of those sympathy pops right now, or the "you deserve it" pops, you know, right now. And in a couple, 3 weeks, people are sick of it.
That's possible too. Yeah, I mean, the fans can be definitely fickle, and what they think is great for 1 week, can change to another. Although, there's some things that they don't seem to be, warming up to at all. And there's some people who get the pops even if Vince tries to bury them, like Cesaro. I mean, there's a guy who really should be accomplishing so much more in the WWE and given much more of a feature role because of the talent he displays in the ring. Yet he, at best, he's a sideshow act with Sheamus. They had the titles on him for a while, but he never gets much of an individual run. And I know he's not a great mic worker, but they could pair him up with a manager. They could, give him a valet, and Vince just seems convinced not to want to push Cesaro no matter what happens.
Well, they had it right with him with the James Bond gimmick. That was what they should have stuck with, because that was cool. And that was something he wanted to do, so he was behind it. But again, they always fix things that aren't broken for a reason.
Yeah, and that's a formula for disaster in a lot of ways, and is one of the things that causes fans to, want to look elsewhere and find another, fed to follow. I mean, I think AEW is better in giving the fans what they want, even if it isn't always the best. I mean, the Young Bucks, I think, are a good example of that. Maybe not the greatest wrestling in the entire universe, and their matches are highly predictable. But, like Bret Hart, they give you a good match every time. I mean, I can't think of a Young Bucks match that really, really sucked. I mean, I'm trying to think back on one. There have been ones that have been better. There's matches that are better than others, but they just don't mail it in. I've never seen them, and I've seen them in indie shows before they were big. Mm-hmm. And the crowd was only, a couple hundred, and they still put on a tremendous show. Up here in Petaluma, actually, a bunch of years ago, a short-lived indie fed flew in the Young Bucks and had them wrestle. And they put on a great show, and so I give them a lot of credit for that. And I think AEW, they push Luchasaurus. Fans like that, they push the New Order. The fans like that, and they were even able to make the New Order survive even when Luke Harper, Brody, yeah, even when he died, they were able to keep that angle alive, which I thought was kind of interesting and not easy to do. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, I think that they have found ways to take guys, and this was something people always said Paul Heyman was good at in ECW. Take guys that might not have as much talent as others, or may not be as entertaining or flashy as others, and find ways to fit them into the show. And like someone like Shawn Spears, to me, not a whole lot of charisma, good wrestler, good look, but not too much charisma as far as I'm concerned. So they put him with Tully Blanchard. They make him the chairman. At least now it's simple, it's subtle, but that's just one example. The Dark Order thing, like you said, they took a lot of guys who would have been probably misfits anywhere else and put them into a group together. And they've been able, and now they're playing into a storyline where they're kind of separating and going into different factions. They've been able to play. People mocked that gimmick when it first started, but 2 years later, it's still going. And it became even more interesting when their leader died and they actually became baby faces from it. They actually became popular then. That's when, unfortunately, a tragic incident is what kind of elevated them to being, more legitimate in AEW. But you're right. I mean, it's just, it almost seems like AEW has made a lot of mistakes, but they also seem like they know how to take lemons and make lemonade. And that's something that...
Or oranges.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, and then on the flip side, it seems like WWE takes lemonade and somehow turns it back into lemons. And it's like a tale of two different companies. However, having said that, WWE is, again, you never can doubt them because they have been known to catch lightning in a bottle so many times in the past that then all of a sudden one guy or two guys get hot and they're back. Their ratings are back. And, they're building around that, and they're able to create storylines coming off that other characters can get involved in, and we can see that again. Like I said, you never count them out. I never grew up a WWE fan. Not a huge WWE fan now, but I also don't doubt the power of that company and their reach.
Well, growing up here in the Bay Area, we were mostly in AWA territory, so we got a lot of the AWA matches. We get a fair amount of WWF matches, when we're growing up, but there was no NWA. There was no WCW. Barely, came out to the West Coast, and we have. I mean, Ring of Honor. If they do stuff, it's only in LA. They've only done one thing here in the Bay Area, and so the Bay Area is a little bit of a different sort of venue, and we got a little bit different wrestling growing up here in the Bay Area than you did out in Chicago, which I always imagined was a more multi wrestling federation city. You got the NWA, you got AWA, and you got the WWE. All came mainly to Chicago, but that was
actually
always...
I'm from closer to St. Louis. I'm from Southern Illinois, so I grew up 6 hours from Chicago.
I see. Yeah, you did mention that.
But St. Louis was the same way. We got obviously we had wrestling at the Chase, where all the different but that's when I was very, very young. But as I got older, local television, we had World Class Wrestling, we had Crockett Promotions, we had the WWF, we had the UWF. Where I lived, you could actually get Channel 6 in Paducah and get Memphis Wrestling. So basically, the whole weekend I could watch her. That's another reason probably why I got addicted, because instead of watching cartoons on weekends, I was watching wrestling.
Yeah, I always had a sixth sense of knowing when wrestling was on. In fact, at my prom, we had a TV in the limo, and I managed to find wrestling in the limo, and me and the other guys that rented the limo were all, giving each other claw holds and sleeper holds, and our dates were just like going, what have we gotten ourselves into? But a different story for another time. I wanted to also kind of get into your mind. Do you ever wish that you could be involved in an indie fed doing booking or doing anything on the promotion side, or is that something that you just sort of said, I did it when I was younger, and that's all kind of in my past? Do you ever think, I'd love to book a fed or be part of an indie federation in my area? Or
I wouldn't mind helping out. I mean, I have done a couple of things with our local promotion here, Stride, and I did ring announcing for them one time. One of my good friends, he was going on vacation with his wife, and so I got to fill in that night, and my favorite wrestler growing up was Ricky Steamboat. Well, the special guest that night was Ricky Steamboat.
Wow.
So to get to be in the ring and announce him as he comes out to be the special guest referee, it was like the thrill of a lifetime. And then to double up on that story, and we still got a topic we were going to talk about, but the kicker on all that was the first magazine I ever got, wrestling magazine I got, had Ricky Steamboat on the cover. That's why I bought it, and I had it with me. And so that night he signed it. It was from 1985. So all these years later, he signed the magazine I bought when I was 10 years old. I still have it in my office now. So
that's great.
That's my high water mark ever in wrestling, and it just happened to be by dumb luck that the local guys called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to fill in? Saturday night or Friday night, whenever it was." And I said, "Sure." And found out that it was going to be Ricky Steamboat, and then of course I'm like a little kid at that point, but it was great. And my wife was there, and she got to meet Rick and everything else, and couldn't be a nicer gentleman, anywhere in wrestling. There couldn't be a nicer guy.
I've heard great stories about him. My favorite wrestler, if you ever wanted to know, was the Spoiler. Loved him. Just loved the big, scary, silent mask guy. That's been one of the angles that I love. As a manager, I keep managing guys, putting masks on them and making me do all the talking for them. That's my, that's kind of an angle that's sort of gone away, and I wish it would come back, where you have the yappy loudmouth manager and his big bodyguard that just stands around and does nothing. I guess Lashley is about as close as you're going to get, but he doesn't wear a mask. So, I do want to, move towards one of the topics that we're going to talk about tonight, and that is just recently they had on Dark Side of the Ring, which is always good for topics to bring up for our show, because there's always some controversy that goes on in Dark Side of the Ring. The latest Dark Side of the Ring is the Plane Ride from Hell, which I just watched the show for it a couple nights ago. And there's a lot to be discussed in that, because of where it was in time versus where we are now. I know there's a lot of people saying, well, it's all been adjudicated and there have been facts that come out since then, and maybe the stewardess wasn't as nice a person as she plays on TV and all of this stuff. But why it's important? Well, first of all, maybe I'd like your thoughts on the just the Dark Side of the Ring episode itself. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think I haven't seen all of their episodes. I've seen most of them. I don't think I've seen a really bad episode of Dark Side of the Ring yet. They do such a great job in between the cutaways to the interviews with and then like the motion picture style vignettes that kind of recreate, and everything's in shadows, and I just think it's really well done. The cinematography on it is great. As far as the content, I think those guys do a good job doing their research, tracking down people. This was I got to be honest with you, for them, this was kind of a ballsy episode to do, because, they're going to have some people now that may be bitter about it and don't want to work with them in the future. At the same time, I feel like it was a story that needed to be said, and I thought it was told very well.
Yeah, well, too well in some cases. It's the controversy about it hasn't died down. I mean, that's one thing, is that a lot of people thought, oh, well, it was 20 years ago, and because it's 20 years ago, people will just move on. Unfortunately, certainly Tommy Dreamer wishes that everyone would just move on. I think Rob Van Dam wishes everyone would just kind of move on, and Ric Flair definitely wishes everyone would just move on from it. But we're in that time now, in that perspective. Well, two things I think are big factors. One is wrestling has had maybe a ground-breaking mentality change about women in the last 10 years. Wouldn't you say that that using women as pieces of meat and as sexual objects has transformed as women have become a greater factor in the ring and are seen as real combatants?
Right. Back in those days, I mean, a lot of times a guy's valet or girlfriend on screen was, let's be honest, a stripper that he met at a club and decided to hook up with. And, hey, you want to be, because she's pretty, let's put her on TV. I mean, I can think of a few of them right off the top of my head that some of the guys ended up marrying, actually. But and that's the other thing. In many ways, I guess the word that I would use, and I mean no disrespect to the women, but from the guy's perspective, or maybe the company's perspective, they were what I would call disposable. We can replace you with any other pretty girl there is out there, because you don't really do anything special but stand there and look pretty. Where now the women are not like that. I mean, women's wrestling in the 90s was almost, at least in America, was almost non-existent. On a major scale, you had girls like Medusa and Malaya Hosaka and people like that were some of the best in the world. But even then, many times they went to Japan to work because there wasn't a lot of work in the States. It was really women's wrestling. How many wrestling cards did you see with a women's match on it? Most of the time, not at all. And if there
Or
was
you have
one.
one women's match, and it would be at the bottom of the card,
Yeah.
right after the
Second.
curtain jerk or right after
Yeah.
intermission. So,
Yeah.
yes.
But now look at women in wrestling. They are as much a part of the show and as much of competitors as the guys are. And in some ways, they're more compelling in their storylines are. So you have to give them credit for, the evolution. And I know that word's already been used for a pay-per-view and everything else, but it really has been an evolution to see where women have come from being sex objects and really not wrestlers in the ring, where you're having bra and panty matches and things like that, to the point now where they're big name players. I mean, these girls are making as much money as the guys are.
And we've seen women in main events now, and the general discussion a lot of times is as much on the women's matches as you have in the men's matches. Although in the most recent SummerSlam and WrestleMania, I thought the women's matches were a real letdown. I was not very impressed with them.
But I will say this again, with the exception of, as I said, people like Medusa, people like Susan Sexton, Malia Hosaka. There were a handful of girls who could really work back in the late 80s, early 90s. A lot of it was hair pulling and slapping and, long rest holds and things like that. What we is light years ahead of what we saw even just 20 years ago in the wrestling business. And I think even the ladies from back then would admit that now it's gone almost to like a futuristic stage. If you had told me at any time in 1990, 2000, that we would be seeing what we see from women in the ring now and them doing the absolutely amazing, stunts and feats that they do now, I would have told you were crazy, because I never thought they would have ever gotten a chance.
Well, and I wasn't sure they were tough enough, but then when I started training with Sarah Del Rey, as she was just a valet back then. And she used to beat the tar out of me every weekend. Yeah, she was practicing, and I used to call her Sarah the Stiff, because she would just she's supposed to slap me, right? But she would miss and cut me right on the ear and just knock me flat. And I, have a ringing ear for the next 2 hours. And, when she would practice the low blows, she'd miss the low blow and hit me right in the junk and knock me flat. And so after a very short time, I was and I also worked a lot with cheerleader Melissa. And a lot of people don't know that her father, who just passed away recently, was a former cop. And he taught her all sorts of police, hand-to-hand combat moves growing up. So she's tougher than a lot of guys, A lot of people, just because she was a cheerleader, people thought, oh, well, she's soft. But, she has Hurricane Run me and done all sorts of other heavy moves to me. So I'm I have a lot of respect for her. And so, where those ladies were an exception for a while, they've now really become part of the business. And now the expectations are so much higher. You don't have, lady, Lita was another lady who really, people saw doing heavy top rope moves, doing all sorts of physical acrobatic stuff that they didn't really think women had a pain threshold for. I have a little extra story too. When we were training the valets, and I always point this out to tell people how dangerous the ring is, because people are like, oh, well, the ring is padded and the ropes are like rubber bands, and you have foam turnbuckles that don't hurt. I said, when we were training, there was this lady who wanted to become a valet, and she was short. She was maybe about 5'4", okay? And we were doing the rope, but we were learning how to do the ropes. And how you do the rope is that you do 3 steps across the ring, turn, put your arm over the top rope, bounce off of it, and then come back. Well, she's so short that she missed the rope, and the back of her head hit the rope right on that part of the back of your head that you get rabbit punched, right in that junction between the spine and the back of your head.
Mhm.
Knocked her out. She fell on her face like Greg the Hammer Valentine, just straight. But it wasn't a work. It was a total shoot, and she fell flat on her face, bloody nose, never valeted again for the rest of her life. And so, and in some ways, I was like, well, you get one physical drawback like that or an injury like that, and you quit. That didn't to me seem like, okay, well, you're never going to make it in the business. But at that same time, I watched Sarah Del Rey blow both of her knees out, come back from surgery, and still continue to wrestle to such a high point where she's now the head of training for women in the WWE, and it's really amazing. It's really amazing where she's gone.
You have to think too, because most of the ladies, Sarah's obviously been around a long time, but most of the in WWE, since we're talking about the current women's division, and we were just talking about the plane ride from hell, what do you think their current women's roster has to think when they see that special and realize this is the company I work for? This is what it used to be like.
Well, they're lucky in some ways because most of these guys, except for like Brock Lesnar, are not wrestling anymore. I mean, Scott Hall's out of the business. Unfortunately, Kurt Hennig's dead. Most of these other guys, Rob Van Dam's retired and so forth. Ric Flair, still kind of, is in the background, but he's not a major function, although I wonder if AEW is going to employ him after all of this. But I think, when I first started in managing, and this was like 2000, my impression of an indie locker room was that it was one part overgrown high school, like high school guys that never grew up, one part military, and one part traveling circus. And so there was that prevailing like macho attitude of like, because you're doing something that you love to do as a kid, and wrestling was aimed towards sort of a more youthful mentality, I think the excuse was, if you're going to act like a kid in the ring, you can act like a kid outside the ring. And you can act like a high schooler that never grew up. And there was a lot of guys that I think when they did their wrestling to keep from ever really growing up as a man and treating people, not just women, but everybody around them, like they were equals.
Yeah, it's Peter Pan syndrome. The boy that'll never grow up, and I think that's illustrated quite a bit with the same thing with the. If you look at that situation and how it unfolded, it was because there was excessive drinking, and they just kept bringing out more and more and more booze, and that's the same thing. Like you said, it's almost I always say the frat boy mentality. That if it's there, if there's drugs there, there's alcohol there, and it's just going to keep coming, and we're going to get it for free. Well, then just keep giving me more and more and more and more and more, and that leads to some really bad behavior. Obviously, I mean, not just on a wrestling company's airplane, but anywhere. And I think that's one of the biggest epidemics in America today, is that most of a good portion of the men in this country have that problem. Not drinking. I'm talking about the not growing up part of it.
And I'm not going to paint with too broad of a brush, but I think a lot of wrestlers didn't go to college. And if they did, they went to community college. They were never part of a frat scene or anything like that. And some of them, I think, kind of felt left out, that they didn't get to party like crazy like some of their friends did in college. And so when they're away from their girlfriends and their wives at the show, especially traveling, if you're with wrestlers that travel, and get away from their general environment, they feel like they have this sort of ability to act in a way that they wouldn't act in front of people that they totally knew. The
other thing too is I think in a lot of ways they're their own, because wrestling, there's still, even to this day, there's still a stigma on pro wrestling, and wrestlers have to take a lot of crap from people. They're their own fraternity, because they're like the rest of the world sees us kind of as freaks. So, but we're all together and we can all hang together and have all this fun and party, and it's kind of our own little world. And that, not that they're not, they're actually inept or anything like that, but I think there is adjustment going from, being the guy you are in the ring, from going on back to being the person. I think it's hard for, let's say, I don't know, let me think of somebody. I think we have character. It's hard for Goldust to just go home and be Dustin Rhodes again, because he had to pretend to be somebody else for so long. And I think that weighs on the guys too. I'm not excusing anybody's behavior on this or at any time, or any of the guys that have been out there, putting halcyon in girls' drinks, or GHB. That was something. I mean, I'm wrestling's had its fair share of sexual encounters that happened over situations.
Yeah, guys go on the road and they think that they, can do stuff that they would never do at home. They feel that there's a kind of anonymity, or that they're invulnerable to making mistakes because they're not home and nobody knows who they are, quote unquote. They know Buddy Sotello, but they don't know Russell Jackman. And so Buddy Sotello can do all these obnoxious things and be so mean to everybody, but Russell Jackman would never do that stuff. But after a while, especially when you start involving drinking and drugs, that barrier that people put up to keep themselves from acting that way in public and against other people really goes away. And so that's another thing that, I wanted to touch on was especially in that early 2000s time frame, the amount of drinking and the amount of drugs that were going on in all forms of sports, not just wrestling, but certainly wrestling being a lot less overseen by any kind of public entity. That sort of thing was very prevalent, and it was very damaging to a lot of people. I mean, not just the wrestlers themselves, but to anyone that was caught, in the crossfire, like what we saw in the plane ride from hell.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of young guys who, big, strong, tough guys, got a lot of testosterone. They're out. They pretty much have limitless money. At the time WWE was riding, I mean, that's when they were at some of their best, when they had really their stride. About, I guess 2000 was one of those years. That year they sort of just broke out, and then they just took off. So it seems like, that time, hey, the money's pouring in. We're super successful. We're the only show in town. We can pretty much do whatever we want. And I think that mentality trickled down to the whole roster, or most of the roster, I shouldn't say that. And, it just exploded on that flight. And apparently it happened on several flights. It happened in arenas. It happened in hotel rooms where the guys would trash hotel rooms. That you can't excuse that behavior. It's almost animalistic in a lot of ways. But, it happened a lot then. Hopefully, I know there's still situations that go on now. And I know we just had a couple young wrestlers basically have been blackballed from the pro wrestling business because of accusations that came out about them a couple of years ago. And I'm done yet. I think that this plane ride from hell thing just is going to open up that can of worms again. And we're going to start hearing about a lot of other people as well. And, if they've done wrong, then good. They should have to be accountable for that. But hopefully it doesn't lead to a lot of people coming out and just making accusations or coming up with rumors.
Yeah, that's another side of it too, obviously, is that there's always that factor that, someone could use this to their own advantage if they wanted to abuse the current Me Too attitude that's going on right now. But it is a change of attitude. I mean, it's a societal attitude where we're not looking at maybe, I mean, you look at like the 80s and like all those teen movies of the 80s, like, and how they haven't aged well. Like I saw Revenge of the Nerds the other day, and what we all thought was kind of funny, where they were doing the spying on the girls with cameras and then, making DVDs out of them, or, making videotapes out of them, You see that then, and it was funny that that'll teach those sorority girls. And then you look at it now, you're like, oh wow, well, if that happened now, they'd all be arrested and sued for tons of money.
And the sad part about it is I've heard guys from the past do shoot interviews. This is just over the last couple of years in fun of the young guys now. Oh no. I don't know what's wrong with them. Seems like none of them ever go out and party, or most of them never go out and party, and all they want to do is play video games, and all of them got, like almost putting them down for not cheating on their wives and stuff like that. I'm like, don't you understand? That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to behave yourself. You're supposed to, it's okay to be a little bit boring, because if exciting means going out and getting drunk and drugged up and sexually assaulting a woman, then I'd rather not be exciting. If that's their definition of excitement.
Isn't there enough going on in the ring that shouldn't be exciting enough? Can't you just be exciting about what goes on in the ring? But I do think, especially when maybe it's less severe now because of COVID, people are not traveling as much, and there's not as much of a culture that fosters it. But I think there's still stuff, as you said, that's going on behind the scenes that people are not as open about it. But it's still, the dialogue needs to continue, and we have to continue to look at the ladies that wrestle and the ladies that work, as referees, that work as attendants for the show, and helping to set up and these other things as equals. Because if there's a belief that people in the wrestling fed are not equal, you have this power vacuum going on, and that's always a level and an area where abuse can occur, when people feel that there's that vacuum of power going on, and that one person is so much more powerful than the other. And I hate to say it, that's not going to happen in the WWE, because one of the worst violators of that concept is Vince McMahon. I don't think there's ever been a human being that has gotten away with as much, as far as that goes, and not had to answer for it, than Vince McMahon. And I know he'll probably send me a subpoena. I'll probably get a summons after this. But the stories of the things that he's done to his inferiors is, pretty legendary and pretty awful. And the dark side of the ring probably won't be able to do one until 30 years after he's dead, because of all the statute of limitations they're going to have to run out. But when you have someone like Vince McMahon, who is known for treating people as objects,
and has had sexual assault allegations himself.
And we know settled for big money on a number of cases. And a guy like Vince McMahon doesn't settle for a dime if he doesn't think he's guilty. So all that stuff is buried and deep underground, but it is eventually going to surface once he dies. And, I wonder, there's no way for Vince to change the culture now, but I wonder if they're finding ways to plan to change the culture once he's gone, once he's out of there.
Well, I think it comes down to, this is a sick comparison, because believe me, it does not equate to what these women, or that, especially that stewardess, went through. But it's going to have to take something like they had to start the wellness policy, because they were not going to test for steroids until all of a sudden now the government's in our neck. And I don't think the government can step in this situation, but there's going to have to be something major to where Vince feels like his company or his corporation is in danger in any way of losing money or losing a gigantic political public relations loss, because that's the only time he will ever do anything. If it comes down to, it has to be something really big, or it's going to be business as usual. because Vince is right. Vince
Well,
believes.
do you think Vince is ever going to sell? That's a major topic. Do you think that Vince will ever sell the WWE to somebody, or keep in the family?
I you know what? Honestly, I wish I could give an answer on that, but I just throw up my hands. I think he could go 50-50. I think if somebody, I think that they're positioning it to where if it ever comes down to the point where Vince steps down, that he's really okay to sell it. At the same time, I also think,
what would he do once he sells it? I mean, it's been his life for so long. First of all, I never thought he'd live to be 75 years old. That if you wanted to take a first thing, that Walt Disney died at age 64.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize that, like, Vince McMahon is 11 years older than Walt Disney. Even though Walt Disney looked about as old as Vince McMahon. It seems like people back then when they were in the 60s, they looked a lot older than the people who are 60 nowadays. Maybe that's just where, you think about, like, the Undertaker's only a few years younger than Walt Disney. You think about that, like, and Evander Holyfield just got in the ring, and he's like right about that same age. So you wonder, like about that. But Vince McMahon, I never thought he'd live this long. But now that he has, I don't know if he'd ever be able to mentally live much longer without having the WWE as his plaything.
I think it would take a major health issue for him to have to step down, and to where he would be basically, he'd have to come to the realization that I have to get away from this now, and I'm sure he'd still be on the phone every day. Yeah, no, that's his way, but I don't know. It's as far as the sale goes, I mean, again, I think if they're positioning it in a way that it could be sold, but I don't think it would be sold right now unless somebody just came in with a blow you away offer. And in the meantime, I think it's probably 2 years down the road is what I'm thinking. Between the next year and 2 years, I think it'll happen, because you've got all these huge conglomerates now buying up all of this content, and what they pride having the most is live content.
Can you imagine?
So that may be very valuable.
Yeah, can you imagine if Disney buys the WWE? What would probably happen to it? The political correctness that they'd have to undergo to make the WWE Disney friendly. That would be
Disney owns some properties though that produce stuff, and again, they've also purchased every franchise out there. I believe they own Star Wars, and I think they own the Marvel. Indiana Jones, and all that stuff. So I mean, Marvel.
Yeah, Disney owns Marvel Comics.
Well, that's right. Yeah, they did buy Marvel Studios, didn't they?
Yeah, so, it's a lot of money. There's no shortage there.
And so you could see very well them saying, "Hey, we have a live coming twice a week or 3 times a week if you count NXT, live programming 3 times a week, 52 days a year or 52 weeks a year." That's the stuff that these companies, these streaming services, they treasure. Live programming and sports programming, and WWE's considered loosely sports programming. So I actually think Disney is going to be the one eventually.
I would like to see some wrestling scaled back. I would not mind wrestling being 2 or even 1 hour programs. To cut down the 3 hours and concentrate the wrestling itself to just 1 to 2 hours or maybe an hour and a half. And what you saw was just action from start to finish. AEW is better at that. And I find I am more entertained with the fact that they get out of the way with their promos quickly and get into the ring and start wrestling. Whereas with the WWE, one of the, I mean, I don't watch SmackDown and Raw all the time, but like maybe about 3 weeks ago, I watched a Raw, and it was from 10 to 11. I saw one match and 2 promos, and in an hour, and a lot of repeats and a lot of ads. And during the match, there were ads. And there's something about respecting the product and giving people what they really want to see, which is action, not promos. I think that Vince has lost. He feels that fans like the promos as much as they like the action. And I think AEW has their, and certainly NWA Power had, or the NWA show when they had Power on, and now with their new show, they get the idea that people want maybe a 5-minute promo at best, and then get in the ring and start moving around. Even if you have rest holds, even if you have guys running around outside the ring and taking a breather, you're better off with that than the 20-minute Triple H promo or the Miz that won't ever shut up. So
I gotta admit, I think that show's called Shockwave, the new NWA show.
Yeah, Shockwave. Thank you. Yes.
I'll admit I haven't seen it. Just that kind of popped in my head, and I said, I think that might be right, but I haven't watched NWA in a while because I'm usually so busy covering the other stuff. I mean, I usually do obviously all the AWA or AEW shows, and then usually a couple of AEW features, and then I throw in a couple WWE things every week, and maybe something on. I've been doing some indie stuff, and it's just kind of a mix and match. But I haven't seen Ring of Honor. I watched about 20 minutes of Ring of Honor, or 30 minutes, I think, of Ring of Honor the other day, and I literally was looking, and I recognized like 2 people on the show. But
feel old, doesn't it? I start feeling old.
Well, and it just makes me realize there's just so much wrestling to watch that I can't. It's not that I hate Ring of Honor. Or like again, I'm
you brought up New Japan or anything like that, and there's a lot of great wrestling in New Japan too.
I haven't gotten to see any of that in a while. I don't think I've seen it since Jericho was there and Omega. I mean, so that's been a couple of years ago. Even right before AEW started. So it's been a while. For those, I mainly focused on AEW, WWE, NXT, and Impact, because quite frankly, you can only write so many stories in a day,
Speaking of, we're almost at the end of our hour here, and it's been great talking to you. Why don't you go ahead? First of all, you mentioned an indie fed that you work with in the area near St. Louis. Did you want to give them a plug?
Well, I don't really work with them directly. I've done a couple things, written some stories for them, just to kind of did some stuff in the local papers for them and stuff like that. And as I said, I took one time ring announcing, but I will definitely give them a shout out because they are one of the best. Just I hate to call them little but we are in like little towns down here in Southern Illinois. But Stride Pro Wrestling, just one of the classiest, most family friendly wrestling shows, and we are from a small area, but they draw big crowds because they always put on a quality product, and again it's basically it's programmed for the whole family. You can take your kids and you're not going to hear a lot of swearing. And
are they on the internet? Can people see their matches on the internet?
You can find Stride Pro Wrestling. You can go to the Stride Pro Wrestling Facebook page, or I believe it's under Stride Pro Wrestling on YouTube. Great.
You should send one of them our way. I'd love to interview those guys on our show. Also, plug Sportskeeda, and anything else that you'd like to plug, or if people want to get a hold of you, how they can do that.
I just did, I just encourage anybody to please check out my work at sportskeeda.com. And I did a stories. Actually, I did one about the resurrection or the reinvention of Ruby Soho, because I think
that's a great article. That's a great article.
And did one on the plane ride from hell that I would encourage anybody to take a look at. And then last word on sports, I just got done doing an indie watch. We do that there where we highlight young up and coming wrestlers. And I did it about a very good friend of mine in Ohio wrestling named AJ Daniels. And he's a great guy, great young guy, high flyer. They call him Mr. Zero Gravity. So as far as me, I'll shut up. You can follow me on Twitter at Ryan K. Boman, Boman, Ryan. And then on Facebook, it's Ryan K. Bowman as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being our guest tonight. You're very informative. We'd love to have you on again as a guest of our show. And maybe one of these days maybe you can interview me for Sportskeeda or write an article about Buddy Sotello. I'm always available for a reverse interview if you're interested.
That would be great. The tables would be turned then, my friend.
I like it. I like it. Thank you so much, and we'll see everybody next week. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank
Good
you.
night.